Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today. Conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Brian J. Jones, the author of The Capitol, the surprising biography of an American building. He's written 5 books now and is a former speechwriter for 2 U.S. senators. Thanks so much for being here, Mr. Jones.
Evan, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And also, AxelbankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to our Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work when you get a chance. Almost exactly 25 years ago, sometime in August of 2001, my parents took me on a trip to Washington, D.C. to celebrate my leaving for college a few weeks later. One night, very late, from what I remember, it was about 10 or 11 o'clock, and I left our hotel room, which was near Capitol Hill, and I walked to the Capitol building. Not only did the dome shine perfectly through the dark sky, I still remember that image, but I was essentially alone. There was 1 or 2 guards. One of them waved and smiled at me in such a genuine way. I honestly never forgot it. I still remember his smiling face as I walked by towards the building. And I was able to walk right up to the very windows and doors that would be smashed in as insurrectionists tried to stop the counting of electoral votes almost 20 years after that moment. And I remember feeling something new, something that our government, thanks to the ease with which I walked up to the main doors of our Capitol building, was suddenly accessible. I thought, what a wonderful country we live in. Uh, all that would change a couple of years later because of the a couple of months later because of the September 11th attacks. So that was kind of a final feeling of innocence I felt for me. Brian, my first question to you is, did those who built the building, intend for it to feel accessible in the way that I felt it that night?
First of all, that it's great you had that experience. As a Hill staffer in the 90s, I had many similar experiences to you. And as a Hill staffer as well, with my name tag, I could get almost anywhere in that building, and that has changed since then as well. Yes, they did intend for it to be the people's building. But this was an issue they struggled with for a long time, mostly once we got into the 20th century. When you had, for example, in 1954, Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire on the floor of the house from the gallery above, and they had really struggled with, what's the safety on this? At that point, they would put metal detectors to allow people into the gallery, but not for the building. So they had always intended for the building to be accessible. It was always viewed as the public's building. It was the center of the American government, which belongs to the people. So they understood the symbolism inherent in that accessibility to it, but really, again, once we got into the 20th century, really struggled with what's the best way to keep the Congress safe, to keep visitors safe, while also ensuring the building remains open and as accessible as possible to the public. It's been very deliberate, and even the approach they've taken to permit access nowadays through the Capitol Visitor Center was all there was a lot of hand wringing, but a lot of deliberation and thought put into how do you allow the public to access their own building.
I want to follow up on what you said, that you had a similar experience, even though you worked there and, of course, were in the building many times as an employee. Did you find yourself ever walking around at night in the dark and looking at the dome and just thinking, wow, what a majestic piece and place this is?
So I lived 6 blocks from the Capitol. And again, as a Hill staffer, I had no car. And I walked to work. And in the evenings, every evening, I would ride my bike from my house 6 blocks away, west toward the Capitol building and dome, and then down the mall and back up again. So every night, I would stop my bike out on the western terrace of that building and look out across the mall, but sitting there literally in the shadow of the dome. It was never not inspiring, to just stick to be first of all, working in that building is amazing, but even just standing at the base of it and looking up at the dome and the way it's lit up at night. And you can. I always tell people you can tell when the Congress is in session. There's a light in the top of the dome, and you can tell which body's in session. There's flags flying over whichever body of Congress is in. There's a lot of messaging going on outside that dome as well. The dome is always telling you a story. The Capitol is always telling you a story. So it was never not an important and inspiring building to me, even as it was my workplace every day for almost a decade.
All right, let's go back to the beginning. At one time, you say that it was the largest public works project in the United States. Before we get into the particulars of how and why it was built, give us some of the stats. How much of an architectural marvel was it when they started to turn this design into reality?
Well, one of the sort of big challenges they had in the design of it even is we didn't really have many professional architects in the United States when they started thinking about this building in 1790. So you had to sort of rely upon American ingenuity and ad-libbing, even in just the design of the building. And there was a professional architect involved. He didn't win the national contest. We can talk a little bit about that. So they had people with the right skill sets involved. But it was a major construction project. You were bringing in huge chunks of sandstone and marble up and down, literally both directions of the Potomac River, coming from up near in Germantown, Maryland, and coming from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and bringing these massive, massive amounts of stone and then dragging them up Capitol Hill, where they were then shaped and put into place. At a time when we didn't have a lot of there was no
There's
powered
no
equipment.
electricity.
No electricity, and eventually we did get steam powered cranes and things like that, even during the Civil War. But it's like building the pyramids almost. And you're in the middle of nowhere at the time they're putting the building together. There is not a lot in Washington D.C., which was always sort of one of the arguments against putting things in Washington D.C. But it was a major infrastructure project,
So I want to
incredibly ambitious.
Yeah, so I want to ask about the dome in particular. Why a dome and why not a pyramid or a cube or any other, an oblong? Why a beautiful, neat dome?
You can thank George Washington for that.
Uh,
When they were getting ready to design the Capitol building, one of the things I love about the Capitol is it was an opportunity for the American public to determine their own American iconography. They put a national contest in the newspapers and said, "Hey, hey kids, submit your drawings. Submit drawings of the Capitol. Submit architectural design for the Capitol building." It let any American submit a design for the U.S. Capitol building. And there's some pretty bad ones. There's some very amusing ones. There's some very charming ones. It would be like when I was a kid, if you would ask me to draw a car, I would draw something that looked kind of like the Mach 5. It like had a lot of points and angles on it, but couldn't exist in 3 dimensions. And you had really enthusiastic Americans sending drawings that probably couldn't exist in 3 dimensions. But there's something really encouraging and charming about the fact they opened it up to the public. And one of the drawings that Washington loved that came in had a dome on it. And Washington loved that dome. And word kind of got out among competitors that Washington really likes that dome. So the winning design by a non-architect named William Thornton, who was a physician by trade, has a dome on it. Now, at the time, it's sort of this push button dome. It's not the big soaring column dome that we see nowadays. But the main reason that the dome was driving the design was because George Washington himself expressed his preference for that dome. Washington loved that dome and wanted that dome.
George Washington left us a lot behind. It's amazing to hear it. His impact stretches to so many areas of our democracy. All right, I want to ask also, how did the United States function in the days before there was a Capitol building? Set the scene for us in terms of how laws were being made, where they were being made, and how the lack of a home base impacted their ability to get things done.
Yeah, so before the Capitol building was even determined where it was going to reside, that was already a conflict and a controversy. Where's the capital city going to be? The Constitution eventually solved that issue and said, how big it was going to be, but left it up to them to determine where it was going to be. So immediately after the American Revolution, it's in New York City. But they are trying to determine where they're going to build the permanent seat of government. So there's a lot of horse trading going on. Anyone who's seen Hamilton knows a little bit about the room where it happens, and the discussion about assumption of state debts. And that was one of the trading cards that Hamilton and Jefferson and Madison had in deliberating where the permanent side of the U.S. Capitol with an A at that time is going to be. The capital with an O comes later. Initially, we're discussing capital with an A, and the agreement is to put it in on the banks of Potomac, and this is around 1790. But in the meantime, it's going to sit 10 years in Philadelphia. That was seen as sort of the sentimental favorite in Philadelphia, while they construct the Capitol with an O as the home for the government. So putting it in D.C. is, again, you can thank George Washington. He was one of the big fans of that. Really kind of liked being closer to home at Mount Vernon. So it really pushed for a what they considered the southern location on the banks of the Potomac. So the Congress has to operate out of Philadelphia, and there's a lot of concern, even when they finally moved to Washington, that any delay in building the building itself or any setbacks is going to make the government more inclined to remove it again. So that, there's always sort of an unsteady agreement about having it in Washington, D.C. When they start building the Capitol building, one of the things that Washington is even impressing on his architects at the time is build this thing fast. Congress is coming in 1800 by law, and you need to have something done. Congress can't come here and have an unfinished building, or we're going to have this discussion all over again about where the government resides. So there was a lot of political pressure as well as just infrastructure issues to deal with.
What does it tell you about George Washington's respect for the separation of powers? That he didn't just say, throw them down the street or build a little shack for them. He really wanted them to have something fit for what he had hoped would be a grand nation.
Yeah, and when Pierre L'Enfant, who Washington taps to design the federal city, there are two major buildings on the first maps. There is the president's house, although L'Enfant calls it president's mansion at first. And there is what L'Enfant writes as Congress House, which is where the House will come. So even in 1790, they knew these were the two big buildings. It's interesting. The Supreme Court is almost an afterthought. They're just going to house that in the Capitol building.
Yeah, forget them. Yeah, we can do what we want.
Yeah,
Yeah,
L'Enfant's not going to have a drawing
yeah.
for courthouse. It's Congress House and President's House. So they knew these were the two symbolic buildings that they needed to have constructed. And it's Jefferson who actually fiddles with the map that L'Enfant has drawn up and strikes the term Congress House. In Jefferson's mind, state governments had state houses, but Jefferson really appreciated the symbolism, again, behind the fact that this was the center of the national government. This is a new experiment. Let's not give it a name so mundane as just Congress House. And it's Jefferson who comes up with calling it Capitol after Capitoline Hill, which was where the center of sort of Roman government was located. So it's Jefferson you can thank for designating as the capital. We may very well have been stuck with just Congress House had L'Enfant had his way.
Where is the cornerstone of the house, and how was it intended to fit into the layout of the capital city?
So to this day, they're still not entirely sure where the cornerstone is.
I read that in your book. I was like, wow, they still don't know.
Yeah, when I started working as a Hill staffer in 1990, and in 1993 was the 200th anniversary of the laying of the foundation. And even then, they weren't sure. They thought they had found it. They found a great big granite block that they thought might be it. But the missing piece on it is when they laid the foundation stone. And George Washington, as a Mason, here he is again, oversaw the laying of the cornerstone. And again, it's hugely important symbolically as well. I mean, Washington is a Mason. Certainly, he would have loved to have been there, but Washington understood that this is, in a way, the executive branch paying its respects to the legislative branch, understanding that in the end of the thing, the people's power is what really matters, and that Washington serves at the will of the people, and comes to lay the foundational stone of what he considers the foundation of the American experiment, the Congress. And so Washington is there on September 18th, 1793, to oversee the laying of the cornerstone. And again, in the celebration, not only they lay a cornerstone, but as part of the Masonic traditions, there is a silver plate etched with who was all in attendance and who the architects were, and that's laid underneath the cornerstone, underneath. And so when they found that gigantic block in 1993 that they thought might be it, further experiments and testing, they didn't find any sign of that silver plate. So the silver plate has been the problem. They think they might have it, but they can't find any sign of that plate, whether it would deteriorate or maybe someone stole it. They don't know. But they sort of left that as one of the great unanswerable questions. There is also a plaque inside the building that was placed in 1893 for the 100th anniversary. And at that time, they sort of declared authoritatively you were standing above the cornerstone of the Capitol. That sign is likely also in the wrong place.
And the understanding is that it would be in the center of the city, the center of the action, even more so than the president.
Yeah, I mean, the other big piece of symbolism in that building is sort of the Mercator lines, if you will, for Washington, D.C. All converge right at the center of the Capitol. It's literally, if you go to the crypt in the Capitol today, it's a room below the rotunda. There's a white star on the floor. And if you stand there, you are considered at the very center of Washington, D.C., at the very center of the U.S. government. And that's where, if you start moving in any directions, you're moving towards First Street, Northwest or Southwest or Northwest or Northeast. That star right there marks where they start drawing those lines dividing up Northeast, Southeast. So you're standing literally at the heart of Washington, D.C. and at the heart of the American government.
We should say a word about how and who constructed the building. Yesterday was Juneteenth, and it is always sobering to hear how these magnificent structures in our national government and our national consciousness were put together.
Yeah, and the Capitol is no different in that it was built by enslaved individuals. A lot of hands are involved in it. There's a lot of ad-libbing going on in that building. There's a lot of compromise, and there's a lot of a lot of our great moments are in that building, and a lot of our really horrible moments are in that building. And one of them is the reliance on enslaved labor. There's some very inspiring stories that come out of that. There's a man named George Pointer, for example, who is enslaved, and one of his jobs is he's working on the boats that are bringing the marble to the Capitol. And he is considered such a good get. He's such a great boat captain and leader that he is permitted to buy his way into freedom and still continues ferrying that marble up and down the Potomac River to the Capitol. So here you have an enslaved individual who's then freed himself, who is bringing in the materials, the raw materials from which we are building the center of our government. Another really remarkable story is a artisan, a craftsman named Philip Reed. And Philip Reed is central to the Statue of Freedom that's standing on top of the Capitol. He did not design it. It was designed by an artist named Thomas Crawford, who sculpted it he's an American residing in Europe. But when it's shipped to the United States, it comes over in 5 pieces. And it's reassembled by another craftsman over here who assembles that so tightly they can't see the lines they can't see the seams of the 5 pieces for the statue, so they can take it apart and cast it. And for various reasons, this craftsman will not take it apart unless he's compensated very well for it. So it's Philip Reed who steps in and says, the statue's got a hook up in her helmet. Why don't you just hang her from that hook and let her pull herself apart under her own weight, and we can see where the lines are, and we can take it apart. So he's the one that sort of cracks that code there. But then he's actually put in charge at the foundry in Maryland, which is casting the Statue of Freedom in bronze. So the Statue of Freedom is ultimately cast by an enslaved individual, and done so skillfully that when he's put in charge of assembling it and reassembling it on the lawn of the Capitol. But by the time the statue was completed and placed on top of the dome, he's a freed man. And his name at first, his enslaved name is Philip Reed, R-E-I-D. And after his emancipation, he changed it to R-E-E-D. So it's like freed, not just Philip Reed, but freed. So another person really, really important to the story of the dome. But there's a very moving through line there that this monument to democracy and freedom and liberty is built in a large part on the backs of those who had none of that.
So Congress moves in. When did they start?
1800.
When did they start using the building? for lawmaking? And
So
how
they
do the early debates go?
Yeah, so they start using the building in 1800. Now, part of the issue was nothing's really done except for one wing of the building. They're constantly running out of money. They're constantly running out of time. Initially, in fact, the Congress envisioned that there would be no federal funding involved in the construction of the Capitol. It was supposed to be all private funding from the
That
sale
sounds
of
so familiar.
from the sale. Yeah, nobody wants to spend a dime. It was initially supposed to be built by selling private lands in Washington, D.C. The development money was supposed to build the Capitol. That never worked out. Eventually, the Congress would start providing appropriations. But there was a lot of dissent and disarray even in the early days. Almost one of the things I loved about this book is almost every chapter has two individuals sort of going at it. And it's usually the architect who's designed it or is in charge of, renovating it or adding extensions to it, and the superintendent putting in charge of doing those constructions. And even early on, there was always enough bickering going on that things sort of ground to a halt. And Washington had to keep stepping in and saying, guys, you have to have something done when the Congress arrives in 1800. So eventually tells them just focus on getting one part of the building done. And when Congress moves in 1800, all that's standing there on Capitol Hill is the Senate wing, which is meant to house the Senate, but houses the Senate, the House, the Library of Congress, and the Supreme Court, all crammed into this very, very small space.
And we should point out it's not the Senate wing that we see today. I mean, this is a completely differently sized building.
Correct. The Senate wing that in those days is actually kind of a corridor in the current modern day. It's the connecting corridor between the central rotunda and the extension where the Senate now works, and those extensions. And a lot of the original material is still there, even though it was burnt in the War of 1812. So that building still exists in some pieces, at least, in the modern Capitol. But it's that little connecting tissue between the rotunda and the current extension.
So that was my next question. The British burned it. How big of a deal does that become in its being rebuilt and then its ability to continue to grow with the rest of the country as the country gets bigger physically and in terms of its population?
Yeah, so at the time the Capitol was burnt by the British, we actually had two wings standing by that time. An architect named Benjamin Latrobe had done a lot of work in getting the house extension built, and it was a house wing built, and it was apparently just a really, really impressive room. We don't have many existing drawings or paintings of it beyond the architectural plans. But even when the British burned it in 1814, there were members of the British troops who burnt this who thought it was a darn shame to burn what they considered such an elegant building, and we're pleading. That's one of the men said, I'll burn boats, I'll burn armories, but I do not want to burn this building. But they burnt that building. And Madison, in a way, was right. He said, this is going to be really bad PR ultimately for the British, which it sort of was. But when they came back to build it, what Madison feared would happen started to happen. People said, well, we should just move the Capitol out of Washington, D.C. then. I mean, this thing is a husk up there. But when they went and looked and did some serious surveying of it, they discovered that the exterior walls were still holding pretty well. Even though it looked terrible. So they start again. And that's sort of what we are constantly doing with that building throughout its existence. Something happens, they go in there, they survey it, and they say, you know what? We're going to start it again. It's the $6 million man, better, stronger, faster. We're going to rebuild this out of really sturdy materials. That was one of the things in the Senate wing, is parts of it were still built from the original timber from the early 1790s. So it burnt. And Latrobe at that time had built part of it with stone arches. That part of the building didn't burn. So that really made it clear to them that the Capitol needs to be built of durable, lasting material. They understood that both the practical and the symbolic nature of that. So they continue to rebuild. They do have to relocate for a while. The Congress works out of a hotel downtown. And then at another point, some private citizens built what ended up being called the Old Brick Capitol that was directly across the street. If you want to see it today, you can't. The Supreme Court stands on that site. But they had the Congress working out of a temporary building while the construction and renovation of the Capitol building was underway. So there was a real effort to make sure that they got to work immediately. They didn't want to have this discussion again about moving it someplace else, taking it back to Philadelphia, taking it to New York, moving it toward the center of the country. The country starting to expand. There were some people who argued, we're starting to move out west. Let's move the capital out toward the west. Let's get it more geographically centered on the nation. They didn't want to hear it. They really wanted to get it to work and get it back in place as quickly as they could.
I was lucky enough to get a tour on that trip I made to the Capitol in 2001 from a staff member to a member of Congress. And
Hmm.
so they show you the old house, and maybe they show the old Senate. I forget already, but
Hmm.
you see the old chamber.
Yes.
Just explain for us when you see the old chamber what we're looking at, what years those were used, and how long they used it for, and then when they eventually abandoned the old chamber.
So the old House and Senate chambers still exist in the Capitol building. If you go to the Capitol, the old Senate chamber has been renovated and restored to look very much as it did throughout up through about 1850. In fact, it's directly above the room that the Supreme Court used, and that room has also been renovated and restored. So you can see where the Supreme Court sat. They were directly downstairs from the Senate. So, and that's in what I call sort of the connecting corridor now between the rotunda. As you make your way from the rotunda toward the Senate wing, you'll pass through that section. That's the old part of the Capitol, and so that was where the Senate worked between about 1817 and about 1855. Over on the House side, it's still considered Statuary Hall. A really beautiful, impressive room, just lined with columns and this high ceiling. And there's a statue of Cleo, who's when she was originally put in place, was looking down upon the Congress and sort of taking notes and watching democracy in action. That room that you're standing in was originally where the House of Representatives did its business. Congress ended up using it as statuary hall originally, where every state could start sending 2 statues per state. Um, there's actually a place in that room where you can stand, and the acoustics were famously weird in both the House and the Senate. But there's still a place where you can stand, and
That's right. You can
your
hear,
tour
yeah.
guide would usually cross the room and put their head down and tell you about John Quincy Adams, who was a sitting member of Congress who died in the Capitol building. And the urban tale on that is that the reason John Quincy Adams was unbeatable in debate is he would put his head down on his desk and listen to the conversation across the room. The story's not in the book, but I always heard this from the tour guides. As far as I can tell, that wasn't actually true because that room's been renovated since then, and they tried to maintain some of the weird acoustics in it. But it's just one of those really great stories in the Capitol, and you will witness firsthand the weird acoustics in that building.
All right, we're going to gloss over some years and years of history here because I have a million things I want to get to with you. So I want to ask about this very famous sort of fact that it was unfinished until after the Civil War. A lot of the books on Lincoln in particular, but on some other things, make it a symbolic moment that the Capitol building was unfinished before the Civil War, and after the Civil War and the country becomes whole again, it is finished, and the Capitol dome does stand in one piece. How apt is that metaphor, and is has it been properly respected over the years, or is this an overblown thing that historians are trying to use to tell a good story?
So it is an apt metaphor because it is true that the dome was unfinished at the beginning of the Civil War and completed almost immediately after it in 1863. Um, but part of the reason that work continued at the Capitol was not for a symbolic reason. It was very practical. There was a firm that dealt in cast iron that had the contract that was a no bid contract, essentially, that partly called for, completion of the dome. So this company out of New York, I think they were out of New York or Baltimore, I can't remember. They were determined to just keep working, and their cast iron was all over the lawn of the Capitol. And it was the dome of the Capitol is not made out of stone. It's not made out of marble. That was one of those things that I had forgotten when I started the book. Is, oh, right. That's all cast iron. You're looking up there and it looks like marble or stone, but it's cast iron painted white, which makes it much lighter than stone or marble would have been. So the firm that's got the contract to construct the dome of the Capitol, they've got these painted white pieces of marble of cast iron laying on the lawn of the Capitol, and partly, again, they have a contract that says you shall finish this, but partly when they're trying to shut a lot of stuff down, and there's no money because they're fighting a war, this firm says, we're going to keep putting this up because there's pigs rubbing themselves against the cast iron out there and rubbing the paint off of this. We've got, we don't want you taking, there was a little concern they might take that cast iron and melt it down and use it for bullets or anything else they needed for the war. So this firm is determined to just keep on working and getting those pieces up, picking them up and putting them up there and using the crane and carrying them up. And just finish the building. So work goes on even when they're not sure there's going to be money in real time. Just because, again, you've got a no bid contract that says you shall finish this, but they also wanted to get their stuff up off the lawn. So the work continues. Lincoln understands the metaphor behind this. So I wouldn't play down, that Lincoln's the one who says, look, work is continuing. The nation's work continues. It's an apt metaphor that is that fits with the reality of the situation as well. But it wasn't one of those things where they said, we want we metaphorically need people to understand the union shall go on. Please continue working. This company was going to continue and get their stuff off the lawn of the Capitol.
That's so funny. I'm glad I asked, though. Interesting response. So I want to ask how you put this book together a little bit here. Your website says that Brian is known for covering iconic creative geniuses who have made indelible contributions to pop culture. Dr. Seuss, Dr. Seuss, Jim Henson, George Lucas, and now the Capitol building. How does that all fit together? Is this an iconic creative genius that you're covering here?
It is. I cover huge iconic figures, and I don't think there's any figure more iconic in American, because most of my figures have been American so far, than the U.S. Capitol building. There is genius involved in that building, and like with a lot of my other subjects, there's luck, there's improvisation, there's bad luck going on. There's genius, there's luck, there's imagination. All of that is going on in the Capitol as well. It is one of those things that when I got ready to take it on, when I was, and I thought of it as a subject, I did say to my agent, I'm not sure, this feels like history to me. And he's like, no, this is biography. This is still biography. The Capitol is your main character. Treat this like you would biography. What was it like growing up? Who raised it? What are people saying about it? And that's really what this book is about. Is the life and continuing life of a iconic building.
What sources did you use to put this all together? And did you have to sort of adjust your mind to go from looking up sources on living people to looking up sources and finding sources on a building itself? How is that different?
So you've talked with enough of nonfiction writers to know that to us, the research is the best part of any project. And for this one, the research was the same as almost any other project. And it's both, at the same time, it's the big difference between writing about a flesh and blood figure versus this is their life is so long that you've got sources that have been around for 200 years at this point, but you also still have the story being told. I mean, in a way, I'm writing about a living figure as well. One of the biggest helps in this subject was actually the U.S. Congress, because there were several times. There's one huge document in the early part of the 20th century when they were getting ready to look at some improvements in the Capitol, and maybe we think about extending out the east front of the building, and they asked for a comprehensive report on the history of the building, and so it's correspondence, it's legislation. It's the original ad that they took out in the newspapers for architects and for people to submit their designs. It's floor debates. It's them bickering about how much money you spend. A lot of government documents on the subject that were all gathered in one place. It's something like 1,200 pages, just a gigantic document. I found that online because it's a government document. I printed it out, all 1,200 pages, and it fills 2 huge fat binders on that. But, thank goodness the Congress actually had the foresight at that time to ask kind of for a history of the building. That was a hugely valuable document to me.
How much did your immersion in the Capitol and in Washington impact your ability to write this story, just given your years as a Senate staffer?
So a big part of the help is because I knew that building so well. It was, I could read about something they were doing, and I would say, oh yeah, I know where that is. I know what that looked like. So it made it very easy to visualize the it made it easy for me to visualize sort of the narrative of the story, even like I'm going to focus on this piece. I know where this is. I know what this looks like. It made it easy for me to describe things. I didn't want this to be an architecture book. I want people to understand this is not, you don't have to know a lot of architectural terms. I'm going to make you learn the terms column and capital and maybe the word, attic and pediment and things like that. But I'm not going to bog you down in architectural terms. I did not want this to be an architecture book. But at the same time, that the architecture was an important part of it and the discussions about it and about the materials put into it. So I think as somebody who had lived in DC and worked in the building and knew that building very well, and again, because I had been a staffer, I had access to areas that are closed off. I think it kept me from worrying too much about bogging you as the reader down in details that you didn't necessarily need. All that information's out there if you want to know more about any of these rooms, any of this architecture, any of Brumidi's art. Those resources are there. But I think the familiarity with the building helped me sort of decide, and I'm hoping it works for you as a reader to say, this is what I think is really interesting about the building because I've been through it. I know where this is. I've heard this story. So I'm hoping that helped you as a reader find your way.
There have just been a million books written about the White House all through history. The White House gets so much attention. Did you just sense a need? Hey, we've got to have a book, a standalone book on the Capitol here.
Yeah, there isn't one. That was really surprising to me. There's a lot of books on, again, there's fantastic books on the art inside the Capitol, and there's fantastic books on the architecture of the Capitol, and there's really charming tour guides, illustrated books about the Capitol, but there wasn't anything that sort of pulled all that together and put this into one place. So this is sort of the first book to try to do all that, to try to tell the story in one spot and give you the architectural piece and the art piece and the political piece and the tour guide piece. It was one of those books that I thought sort of needed to be written. It had not been done, which again really surprised me.
Not to make you betray your own history here, but and I don't know if you want to give this up, but I do want to ask, who did you work for in the Senate, and how did that time in your life impact this?
So this book is dedicated to the old PVD gang. And
So I wanted to ask about that was one of my questions. What is that?
PVD is Pete V. Domenici. I am a New Mexican.
You're of the Southwest. Okay.
I grew up in New Mexico, and Domenici was my senator my entire life. He was first elected to the Senate, I think, when I was 5. And I went to go work for him when I was 22. And he was there even after I left Capitol Hill in 1999 or 1998. It was one of those experiences that Domenici was sort of an icon in the state, and Southwestern politics are a little different than Eastern politics and Western politics or Northwestern politics. It was a really it was a time as well too. I don't think it's one of those, like, I don't want to get dewy-eyed about it, but it's really a sort of a lost time in politics too as well that time. But it was a lot of young people who had gone to DC to work for their own member because they wanted to do good things for the country, for the state of New Mexico. One of the great things we got to do is every day, you take phone calls from people in, Ruidoso and Hobbs and, little towns all over Espanola, all over New Mexico. That was the great thing about working for a senator, almost as opposed to a House member, because we weren't just a region, we were the entire state. So you really learned a lot about your state and these little communities that you didn't necessarily, even growing up here, pass through. Anyway, it was a really formative time. It was my first real job out of college. I was initially hired as just a writer. I was hired to answer constituent mail, which really helps you learn your issues. And then right after the election of '92, this is sort of happens in a lot of staffs. After there's an election, a lot of your senior staff sort of say, I'm going to move on. And there were all these sort of young, snot-nosed 20-year-olds that the legislative director said, bring them up. So we all sort of came up through the ranks and did it all together. So there was people often joke that it was our Vietnam. It was this very close-knit group of, 20-somethings living on the Hill. No one has any money, and you're living in group houses with 3 or 4 people. No one's got a car. But it was the best time of our lives in a way. And you're learning political process, and you're learning the history of DC, and you're learning the history of your state. and you're learning about politics and different people, and we were one of these offices that it was really important as a delegation that we all speak with one voice between, I think at that time there were 3 Republicans and 2 Democrats. The New Mexico delegation is not gigantic even to this day. And it was always really important to our member, for example, if we were going to do anything, to go to make something bipartisan. Domenici and Paul Wellstone from Minnesota, for example, crafted legislation on mental health and making sure mental health was covered as a health benefit, that it wasn't just, mental illness was seen as actually something that was a health issue. We did a lot of work with Sam Nunn on things. It was always really important to make stuff bipartisan, sort of a different time now, I think. But that was my story as a young staffer. We all came up at the same time. And that was why I dedicated this book to that particular group of people who we are still to this day all over the map politically. We're all over the map geographically. But it's one of those you can still throw us all back together. And it's the same stories over and over again, because that's what happens. But it's like you get people together and it's like talking about, your high school or college days. Remember when I scored the touchdown? Remember when I passed this bill? We all still do that.
Who was the second senator?
Jeff Bingaman.
Oh, Okay, cool. So you're a Southwestern. How did the building, back to our hero here, how did the building evolve through World War One and World War II as America starts to push towards civil rights bills that become perhaps the building's finest moments?
So you still have some, the building is essentially the silhouette and basic profile of the building is still looks much as it did in 1863 when the Statue of Freedom went on the very top of it. But then they were constantly, one of the big repairs is they took that east front, and the Capitol is not considered to this day, at least, to have a front side. When it was finished, there was a clear point where you came into the building. You came in from the east side. Now they call it the east front and the west front. You can access the building either way. And there was discussions about pulling that east front out a little bit because it was still nestled up almost straight underneath the dome, and they had these 2 big extensions on either end that extended way out, and people thought it looked odd. It was one of those things, even I think Bullfinch in his time was like, I would really love to move that thing out, and never got it. So that was one of the big sort of ambitious projects that doesn't finish up until I think even in the early 60s. And their air conditioning changed lives in the U.S. Capitol. The Congress didn't always meet all year long, for example, because it was hot. And even trying to get airflow through that building and heat it better, the air quality was always kind of bad. It was stifling hot in the summer, so Congress did not work all throughout the year. They would tend to go home for summer recess for a reason, because the building was just stifling hot. Air conditioning changed lives, and it changed the way the government worked. The government could start working longer now and could work throughout the summer. Whether that's a good thing or not, I'll let you decide. But that really changed the way the government did business, at least in the Capitol building. As the metaphorical and literal center of American government, a lot starts to go on inside that building into the 20th century. There's people are setting bombs off inside the building. There's a bomb set off by a young man named Eric Munter in protest of American involvement in World War One, which we weren't involved in at the time, and didn't like us sending money to munitions and things to Europe. And is making a political statement by setting a bomb off. It doesn't harm anybody, but it blows open part of the building that has to be renovated and rebuilt at that time. And there's an assault. There's a Puerto Rican nationalists opened fire from the gallery of the House in 1954 on the House floor below, and actually wounded 5 people. One of them very seriously, who did recover. But one of my favorite pictures in the book is of these just teenage, early 20s young pages carrying this member down the stairs of the Capitol on their shoulders on this gurney. You can see the member's feet in the picture. And one of these young pages is just screaming at the press, no pictures, as he comes down the stairs. Just a really dramatic picture, really fantastic shot. That goes on in there. So it's the American psyche sort of gets wrapped up in that building at various times. In 1850s, in 1856, Charles Sumner is assaulted by a Southern member, beaten almost to death by someone who whips him with a cane for expressing anti-slavery views on the floor of the Senate. And this House member saw this as a personal affront, because Sumner had actually named names of people and said, you need to know these people stand for the enslavement of people, and got whipped almost, within an inch of his life. So, violence is baked into that building, just as it's baked into our culture. It's baked into our government. It's baked into who we are.
And John Quincy Adams has died in the building, and Abraham Lincoln was laid in state at the building, and several other presidents lay in state there, and
You know,
the States of the Union are
I did not
held
realize
there.
that the first actual assassination attempt on a sitting president was inside the Capitol building. That was one of those facts I did not know until I started doing research. It was Andrew Jackson had come from a funeral for a House member, and he was walking out the east front. He was walking through the portico, and someone stepped out from behind a column, pulled two pistols, both of which misfired. And Jackson, tries to whip the guy with his cane, and they sort of have to restrain the president. But the gunman is wrestled to the ground by several congressmen, including Davy Crockett. And the Smithsonian, I think, later did an analysis of the pistols, found them both in perfect working condition, and determined that the odds were something like 125,000 to 1 that both those pistols would misfire. But that happened in the U.S. Capitol building. The first assassination attempt on a sitting president is in that building.
What does it say that presidents who lay in state lie in state? Lie in state?
Lion
What does
State.
it say about that presidents who lie in state are brought to the Capitol building and not to their own home, the White House?
I think it shows the deference of look, we have checks and balances built right into the Constitution. It's the way the system's set up. But I think it still shows that there's a deference to the people, not even to the Congress. There's a deference to the people. The chief executive is elected by the people, and the Capitol itself is a monument to the voice of the people. So I think they understand the symbolism, and it's when they put Lincoln in state in there, they really understand the symbolism of this. That there's a symbolism in bringing the figurehead for the federal government, for American democracy, home to the heart of American democracy, which is the dome of the Capitol. Not just the Capitol building, but literally at the center of the Capitol. The catafalque, the coffin of the president is put directly over that spot you and I talked about a little earlier, which is the literal center of DC, the center of the Capitol building. That's where the president's body lies in rest. I mean, there's a very strong symbolic statement in that the head of the government elected by the people is returned to the house of the people to be honored there.
I'm very embarrassed that we are just glossing over centuries of history here because there's so much to get to, and there are a million topics that we could discuss. But I do want to get to January 6th before we start to wrap things up. What impact did that have on you as a former staffer, and how did you try to tackle January 6th in this book?
So it was huge. I mean, this book was written because of January 6th. This was my response to January 6th as a Hill staffer and as an American. I watched it happen in real time on television, and I had a TV on in my office at home, and I was, this is still we're coming out of COVID at that time, but we're still working at home. And I remember coming up out of my seat when they cut to the cameras, especially in the chamber of the Senate, which is where I worked, and seeing someone sitting in the vice president's seat. And the last time that happened, an invader, it was George Cockburn standing up in the House chamber saying, "Shall we put torch to this building?" And in 1814. This is someone in the Senate who is sitting in the vice president's chair, and people rifling through the papers of members. And even as a Senate staffer, getting on that floor, there's a reason it's called floor privileges. It's not a floor right. You can't just waltz in there, even as a staffer. You have to go into the cloakroom, into the lobby, and check in, and they have to make sure that you're on the list. It's a privilege, even as a staffer, to be on that floor. It's a really special place. And once you're on that floor, we can't just wander down into what they call the well there at the front, where the vice president sits and where the parliamentarian sits. It's a really important place. It's a really special place.
Yeah, one of the guards, I'm sorry, one of the
Go ahead.
guards even says to the guy who's at the front of the building, he even says, "This is like the most sacred space that we have. If we could please get out of here." The
Yeah.
guard really
Yeah.
felt the weight of all that.
Yeah, and it made me. I remember just screaming in my office, "You have no right! You have no right!" And my phone is ringing, and it's people I've worked with who are saying, "Can you? Are you watching this? Is this great? Can you believe this?" And I couldn't. It was just so surreal, and seeing the Confederate flag inside that building where it had never been before.
Yeah, that was hard. That was
It
really
was hard.
Yeah.
So and then being told later that these are patriots. And and they were visiting the building, and that or that it was a psyop. I mean, just hearing all this nonsense about it, just really made me profoundly sad and angry. And at one point when I was working on this book, I want to confess, like, my therapist actually said, "You're writing this book. You need to learn to fall in love with it. Fall in love with the Capitol again. Fall in love with your book. Don't write this book is because you're pissed. Write it because you love this building," which really helped me center myself on that, because this was initially my act of defiance in a way. But I settled down into it. But that, this was my response to seeing that and to hearing just the con about it. I wanted people to understand, look, this building matters. This is why we're so upset seeing what was going on in there and seeing them attacking policemen and trying to threaten to hang the vice president and having to usher away the Speaker of the House. This building really matters, and it's well thought out, and this is symbolic, and it's not like you're raiding a Kmart or the Library of Congress. This building is really important. It really matters, and what we saw there really happened. But this is so this, somebody described this book as a love letter to the building, and I really like that. I think it's fair. I got there. Like I said, I had to be told, fall in love with your book, and I did get there. But this is sort of my way of telling the Capitol. This is sort of my love letter back to the Capitol after that.
What would you do to better preserve the Capitol building and preserve its history beyond this book and preserve the physical structure that it is?
I think the Congress is getting there. I mean, part of it has to be some self-awareness. And I hope this book gives us some self-awareness on that. I hope some members are reading it and will understand the importance of the building and understand the deliberate symbolism that's put in this building. One of the real ironies behind the Capitol is one of its staunchest advocates, and who kept saying, you have to build this building to last. You have to build it out of great materials. The things have to be well thought out. Get great artists to decorate it. One of the people that really led the charge on that was Jefferson Davis. He was the Senate chair of the public works of public buildings. Just the irony there. But that was somebody who, even at that time, understood that infrastructure is identity. That these buildings really matter. They matter for reflecting who we are and what we stand for. So I'm hoping that Congress, that we as a nation, as a collective nation, and that our elected officials understand why this building matters. And I think I think the visitor center itself is a way of making sure that the building doesn't get beat up too bad, and that you can keep that access, you can keep the public moving through it safely, and keeping the members safe, and keeping the building a little safer as well. So I'm hoping that it's some self-reflection, I think, is one of the biggest things we need.
It is just a fact that the White House has been changed dramatically over the last several years. Will the Capitol ever be changed again in a way that makes the entire silhouette look different?
God, I hope not. That was one of the things that when, again, it's so fascinating, because it's the way the American experiment always works. The dome of that building that we consider so iconic, that is the silhouette of DC. I mean, you put that up on a poster in just silhouette, people know what that is. They know what that building is. Was almost a happy accident. It was an architect who, as he was extending, Thomas Walter was hired to build the extensions on the ends of the Capitol, because the Congress is growing so large, they need more space. And as he's putting these, drawing the additions on this building, he realizes, God, that dome that's there right now is going to be way too small on this building. And just nobody asks him, but he draws on a 7-foot piece of paper the Capitol building with this bigger dome. It looks very much like the one that's there now, but just draws it because he just thinks that it would look better. Members of Congress walk by, see that paper hanging there, and say, can we get that? We would really like to have that dome. Again, there's no real foresight into it. It's a happy accident. So, a lot of things that have defined that building were because of accidents, because of imagination. Sometimes it was because we had to rebuild something after a bomb went off inside the building. So, I really hope that our better angels continue to keep that in mind with the Capitol. There's not a lot of places to go up on Capitol Hill. It's 58 acres, but I don't know if anybody's going to be inclined to start peeling pieces off it. If we add additional states or something, there might be a point where someone's like, we need to think about these extensions or maybe putting extensions on the extensions. I mean, that's a long way down the road if you start adding additional states. And there is plenty of room on the Senate side to do that. I'm not sure on the House side. Yeah, it's one of those, when you watch the physical changes going on down at the White House, there is a system in place to keep that from happening that was completely disregarded. And the Capitol has a process for doing things as well. The White House, that it's under the authority of the Congress. I would really hope that the Congress has the wherewithal to manage itself. Should anybody start proposing, we start ripping pieces of that building off.
How can we help Americans feel closer to the lawmakers? And maybe a better way to ask that question is if the Capitol building were made accessible or if the accessibility to it were enhanced, do you think that would be a way to encourage Americans to feel close to their lawmakers and also to just feel as if the government can and does work for them?
You know, the cynic in me often worries that we're too far gone on that. But then the former staffer in me really hopes that we're not. And the optimistic American really hopes that we're not too far gone. And I mean, if you are in Washington, D.C., similar to your experience, walk around it. You can still walk around it. You can't necessarily start just pulling open doors, but you can still walk around the building and just walk in the shadow of that building. Go through the visitor center where they actually have curated it very well. You can actually see little models of the Capitol in its various forms over the years. So if there's places in the book where I talk about something, you're like, and you think I would love to see that, the Capitol Visitor Center likely has a model showing you what it would look like. There was even a really terrible idea at one point to put two domes on the Capitol building. I believe that model is even there someplace. Learn all you can about the government. It's yours. You earned it. It's yours, and demand accountability of your elected officials and that they do better and have them learn more about that building. This is not just a government building. Again, that gets back to Jefferson saying, we're not just going to call this a Congress House. This isn't some run-of-the-mill government office. This is the center of the American experiment. Demand better of your elected officials. Demand that they understand this is the center of the American experiment. It belongs to you. Learn what you can about the American experiment.
Favorite rooms of the Capitol?
I still love walking into the old Senate chamber, which again was restored I think in the 1970s to look as it did back in the day. I still love just standing in there and trying to imagine what it was like back then. Even that's the same room where poor, Charles Sumner was caned.
Yeah, I was going to say you can imagine the beating. Yeah.
Imagine that, and just the gumption of someone striding from the House. It was a sitting House member that did it to him. Came out of the House chamber, strode across the rotunda, and went.
Yeah, that takes some stones there.
Stormed onto the floor. So that's one of my favorite rooms over there. I do love the corncob capitals that are still. If you look up in certain places, you'll see sort of an American architectural iconography instead of the usual sort of floral. Capitol is a decorative item that sits on top of a column. Benjamin Latrobe said that he wanted an American architecture and so put corn cobs on the top of these, and you'll still see some of those corn cob capitals in the building today. I still just love sitting in the gallery, even and just watching both either the House or the Senate debate. But just walking through the building itself, the statuary hall, because again, that's the old House chamber, still looks a lot like it did back in the day. Those two chambers, the old House chamber and the old Senate chamber, to me are some of my favorite rooms in that building.
I just remember walking in there on my tour and looking up at the rotunda. What a beautiful sight that is. And then I also love that each state can contribute 2 statues, which I think is so cool.
Yeah, and it's actually, and I had forgotten that the state that finally finished it off, every state's permitted 2 members. You have to make it in either bronze or marble. And the final statue, meaning every state finally had 2, came from New Mexico. And it was Popeye, who was sort of one of the Tewa leaders.
Which lawmaker, alive or dead, loved the building or loves the building the most? Who appreciated the most working there?
Who appreciated the most working there? That is really hard to. That's really hard to say. Oddly, one of the people, I don't know if oddly is fair to say, but who I think really got it was John Boehner. When Boehner was there, when they gave Constantino Brumidi, who painted the gigantic fresco in the dome of the Capitol. If you stand in the floor of the rotunda, look up, that's Brumidi's art, and his art's all over the Senate side in particular. And Boehner's the one who, when he's speaking they gave Brumidi posthumously the Congressional Medal of Honor. And
Wow.
Boehner gets choked up talking about it and really sort of gets it. And understands, like, how important Brumidi is to the building, and how important the building itself is. Even the current architects of the Capitol, you read some of their remarks, like they tend to really understand the gravity, and they've changed the way that architect is appointed now. So it's almost completely in the hands of the Congress. It used to be the president it was almost like advise consent, where the president could appoint and the Congress would approve. They've removed the president entirely from the equation at this point, so the Congress can do it.
When it comes to the appreciation for working there, did the staff members find that being in that environment made the work feel all the more urgent? You're not elected. You're there at the pleasure of your
Yeah.
boss. They all call them their boss. Did working there make it feel like we have a lot of work to do here, and this is really important and potentially grand work to do?
Yeah, I mean, it makes everything feel important. I talked at one point about, um, so we, you know, some days the senators, it's admin, would say, it'd be 7 o'clock p.m. and she would say, "Senators over on the floor," and he lived 3 blocks from the Capitol. She said, "Senator's over on the floor, and he's just going to walk home afterwards. So somebody needs to take him his briefcase and his coat." We would fall all over ourselves to be the one that got to take the briefcase and the coat. We weren't even doing official work. We just were gonna we because we would get to go into the building, and we could get onto the floor just to go hand him his briefcase and his coat. You didn't necessarily have to be doing anything, but you got to exercise your floor privileges. And the way you walk in is you go in through the cloakroom at the back. And you come in through that cloakroom, and then you open the door, and it's almost like a movie. You sort of like open those cloakroom doors, and there's the set in front of you of the Senate, looking pretty much the same as it has since the 1860s. It's been repainted, and some of the color schemes are different, but still looking like that. Everything feels important, I guess, is what I'm saying. Even just taking the briefcase and the coat to your member at 7:30 felt big and important.
Sorry for you, but a lot of sorry for you as a creature of the Senate, I should say, but a lot of our focus in our democracy is on the president. And so I want to ask, did you ever witness an interesting moment between your senator and a president, or did you catch a president or a vice president behind the scenes in a moment that we may not be aware of as members of the public?
No, I did not. I did not. The closest I ever got to a president in person during my time is I was walking home for lunch one day. Again, I lived 6 blocks, so there was one day I just decided to walk home, and I was standing on the corner, and they had stopped traffic, and I didn't know what was going on. I'm the only person standing on this street corner at, like, I can't remember where I was. It was for Second Street or something, and the presidential limo walks by, and I'm the only person on the corner, and Bill Clinton waved at me because I was the only person. That's the closest I ever got to a president.
That's cool. What's next for you? Do you know if you'll do another book on history and politics, or will you go back to your interesting figures of pop culture?
Yeah, I don't know. This is sort of doing a book like this has sort of opened up other possibilities for me on potential subjects. I still love writing about people. That was one of the great things about this book, is I could still write about a lot of people. The issue I tend to have is the people that I do are very big and iconic, and so a lot of folks come up to me and they'll say, "Well, you've done Jim Henson and you've done George Lucas. You have to do Bowie now, so you get the Labyrinth trifecta." And Bowie's been done, and he's been done pretty well. So, it's like a lot of these big figures have been done, or people are doing them. I'm a huge Beatles dork, and at one point I actually made a run at Ringo, who told me no with peace and love, peace and love. But I made a run at Mick Jagger, who said no, nobody cares. Bob Spitz just put out a big, beautiful book on the Rolling Stones. It just
Nobody
came out.
cares.
He's just like, I'm not, Keith Richards wrote his memoir. No, nobody's going to care what I have to say. And, it's like, of course people want to know what you have to say. I thought about doing REM. I think there was one of those weird connections. My agent and Michael Stipe's kids knew each other or something. And so we'd actually made a run at REM, and they said no, but somebody's doing them anyway. I like to write about these big figures, but a lot of these big figures get done. And sometimes you can do a book without their participation. I did not have George Lucas, for example. He did not participate. Sometimes people say they can't believe that because it seems like he did, which is very flattering. There's some books where it's like, if I can't get that person, I don't think I could do it otherwise. There's some you can. Again, I did Lucas without him. So that's a long roundabout way, Evan, is saying I don't really know. The possibilities are endless, which is what makes it frightening sometimes.
All right. Brian J. Jones, the author of The Capitol, the surprising biography of an American building. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Evan. This has been great.
Make sure you check out his book and also his website, brianjjones.com. Axelbankhistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and a link to our Patreon page. Check out Nikki's work and definitely go to that Patreon page to ask for your support, or we're going to ask for your support to keep the show going. Go to patreon.com/axelbankhistory. We're going to donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We'll see you next time. Thanks.